Let me start by telling you that as bad as I think it is, I don't believe globalism is a sinister conspiracy. Many actually believe it's the right way to go, or haven't paid enough attention to geopolitics to realize how much the average citizen in a developed country has to sacrifice for true globalism to work. Even among most elected officials, the broad understanding of international diplomacy and politics escapes them at the level of globalism. When a well-researched constituent confronts their congressman with questions from the overwhelming number of pieces in the complex puzzle that is understanding globalism, one can easily come off as a tinfoil hat-wearing nut. So let's try to tell the truth here. And as with all my videos, I try to reconcile the issue with how one keeps the practice of true Christianity at the core of one's worldview. So globalism has its start, at least in the last 400 years or so, with some of the old families of Europe consolidating wealth and power into central banks for each nation-state. A central bank is basically a national bank, and a nation-state is a country. The bank has owners like any private business. Naturally, the choice of who gets loans and credit will be determined by the goal of any business to make money, but also the goal of influencing the issues and movements important to the shareholders, which happen to be, in this case, a very small and very rich group of people. Yeah, we're generally not invited to their parties. America, during her first century, often caused the super wealthy to salivate. Imagine gaining control of the financial system of a strong, growing country with all those resources. Wood for lumber and ships, tobacco. The relationship between the new government and the big money institutions of old Europe had been love and hate at best. In George Washington's papers, he specifically writes about the Bavarian Illuminati, newly formed in Austria by Adam Weishaupt. Washington was well aware of the goal of the Rothschilds to influence American finance. In the 1790s, the big fights between Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson were focused on the formation of a banking system that many feared invited the influence of the European families they had just thrown off during the Revolution. Approaching the mid-19th century, our seventh president, Andrew Jackson, seeing what control the banks had over the country's economy, defeated Nicholas Biddle and the central bankers in a historic battle, even surviving assassination attempts that history has now shown to be paid hitmen. On his deathbed, tradition teaches that Jackson said, "I killed the bank." Later, financing the Civil War made strange bedfellows for President Lincoln, who had to balance loans at times and at other times print U.S. guaranteed silver certificates. Remember, at the time, there was no direct tax on citizens with which Lincoln could run the war, only tariffs, which consequently increased for the Union between 1861 and 1864. Eventually, our own robber baron elite rose to power, refining America's resources. Names like Carnegie, Rockefeller, Morgan, Vanderbilt, and more. Undeniably, they struck deals with old Europe as they traveled the Atlantic conducting business and even had to bail out the U.S. government on at least one occasion. By the time the world wars of the 20th century were approaching, the wealthy European bankers had become quite organized and persistent in their attempts to gain influence in the U.S. markets, now joined by the American elite in their goals. Several secret meetings at Jekyll Island, Georgia, are known to us in primary source material, as the big names met using pseudonyms to lay out plans for how they would get what they wanted, a central bank. There is no denying that access to this level of capital helped America burst onto the international scene like new money. Conspiracy theories aside, though, war profiteering is not a new phenomenon. As America fought World War I and then II, this became clearer than ever. The military industry was a piece that fit into this puzzle perfectly. What with the sharing of equipment and resources to crush enemies into submission by overwhelming the enemy with force. The banks, though, that fund national war machines were already well in place by the time America came into her own. Often the same banking family funded opposite sides of the same war. So the Federal Reserve had an instant impact. They printed cash and loaned it to America with interest on the promise of being repaid by tariffs and, for the first time, tax revenues. Hello, IRS. Each time a new appropriations bill, pet project, or dam needed to be built, the Fed fired up the machine and printed more cash, essentially creating debt. the groundwork for what's called fractional reserve banking, which we practice today, was put into motion. Essentially, today's cash pays yesterday's debt. It's what's called a Ponzi scheme, but with a guarantor, you and I. The second major development of Wilson's time that set the stage for where we are today was the formation of the League of Nations. While the early version of the League failed somewhat, it set a precedent that left most parties interested in international collaboration and control on some level. The benefit could be the control and allocation of the resources of smaller nation states by the bigger ones, while ensuring better human rights practices and increase in the mean quality of life as a trade-off. The World War II era saw further cohesion of international leadership coalitions, of course supported by the central banks of various powerful nations and their international racial, social, and political interests. The post-World War II Marshall Plan would certainly give all the financiers of the world a cut of the pie to rebuild the world. A system of war that's in place to this day, with contractors now providing security, general contracting, banking, and retail by Fortune 500 businesses connected to the UN circle of big central banks. Often it's the aggressor country itself moving in to profit from the rebuilding. Under Truman, the military was reorganized into the framework we recognize today. And by Eisenhower's time, coalitions between international powers, central banks, elements of the U.S. government, and military industry existed outside the scope of the president's authority. This was highly concerning to Truman, Eisenhower, and John Kennedy. President Kennedy saw the issue almost immediately. He couldn't implement his plans with elements of the government operating black budget schemes without his knowledge and authority. He tried to rout out those rogue elements of the government and restore America's financial independence. He fired powerful CIA leadership, made inquiries into many military projects, and put some gold-backed notes into circulation. He was killed on November 22nd, 1963. These events may or may not have contributed to his murder in broad daylight in the streets of Dallas, Texas that day.